Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to the Backfighter Knowledge Exchange, Handwashing 2.0, Why is it so complicated? With guest Dr. Don Schaffner of Rutgers. We want to welcome everyone on our call today. During the question and answer session after our interview, Dr. Schaffner will respond to your questions. Housekeeping note, when we go to the Q&A mode, you'll hear it in your ear, in your headset, that we're going to the Q&A mode. At that point, if you press *6 and then 1, you'll be able to ask a question, and we'll see that and call on you. *6 and then number 1. Okay? Before we get started today, I'd like to review the standard hand washing recommendations for consumers. Hand washing is an important part of preventing microbial cross-contamination in food service, in healthcare settings, and of course at home. So according to the CDC, these are the steps consumers should take to clean their hands. I'm going to do the Cliff Notes version as Dr. Schaffner will be going over these in detail. So the first step, wet your hands, apply soap, lather up, lather the backs of your hands, fingers, and nails, scrub for at least 20 seconds, rinse with running water, and dry your hands with a clean towel or air dry. Now at the Partnership for Food Safety Education website, we reinforce these steps for use at home. As a key part of the Core 4 Food Safety Basics, Backfighters recommend that consumers wash their hands with warm water and soap for at least 20 seconds before and after handling food, after using the bathroom, changing diapers, and handling pets. So now our speaker today will help to explain the science behind the recommendations. Dr. Donald Schaffner is an extension specialist in food science and distinguished professor at Rutgers University. Dr. Schaffner holds a BS in food science from Cornell University and an MS and a PhD in food science and technology from the University of Georgia. His research interests include quantitative microbial risk assessment and predictive food microbiology. Dr. Schaffner has authored more than 150 peer-reviewed publications on topics including cross-contamination and hand washing. He has also educated thousands of food industry professionals in the United States and around the world. Dr. Schaffner has served on a variety of national and international expert committees, and he is the co-host of a fun podcast on microbial food safety at foodsafetytalk.com. And now to you, Dr. Schaffner, welcome, and thanks for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. So there are a variety of competing, what I'll call quasi-science-based hand-washing recommendations from various agencies in the United States and around the world. And those recommendations are for healthcare workers, for food service workers, and for consumers. The recommendations differ depending upon the audience and also on the work environment where the person is expected to be washing their hands. What we're going to try to do in today's knowledge exchange is to look at the science behind those recommendations to help us advise consumers on best hand washing steps for their situation. I'm going to talk about what the FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition says in their food service hand washing recommendations that are part of the FDA Model Food Code. I'm going to touch on the CDC's hand washing recommendations for healthcare. I'm going to talk about a recent paper that we published in the journal Food Protection Trends on the signage that's available out there directing people on how to wash their hands. And then I'm going to hopefully tie all of those thoughts together with a discussion on the difference between risk assessment and risk management and why it's sometimes so hard to come up with consistent recommendations.
Great. Really interesting. And I just want to mention that we have 483 people register for today's talk. So this is a very popular topic. So Dr. Schaffner, how and why do FDA and Sift guidelines on food service hand washing differ from CDC consumer guidelines?
Right. Well, the CDC consumer hand washing advice is more or less as follows. The CDC says wet your hands with clean running water, warm or cold, turn off the tap, and apply soap. The next step in the CDC advice, lather your hands by rubbing together with the soap. be sure to lather the backs of your hands between your fingers and under your nails. CDC goes on to say scrub your hands for at least 20 seconds and suggests that if you need a timer, you can hum the happy birthday song from beginning to end twice. Next, the CDC recommends rinsing your hands under clean running water and then drying your hands using a clean towel or air dry. Now, the language in the FDA, the 2013 FDA Model Food Code, is much more specific because this is regulatory language. So I will now read to you verbatim what it says in the FDA code. Food employees shall use the following cleaning procedure in the order stated to clean their hands and exposed portions of their arms, including surrogate prosthetic devices for hands and arms. 1. Rinse under clean, running, warm water. 2. Apply an amount of cleaning compound recommended by the cleaning compound manufacturer. 3. Rub together vigorously for at least 10 to 15 seconds while A, paying particular attention to removing soil from underneath the fingernails during the cleaning procedure, and B, creating friction on the surfaces of the hands and arms or surrogate prosthetic devices for hands and arms, fingertips, and areas between the fingers. 4, thoroughly rinse under clean, running, warm water. And 5, immediately follow the cleaning procedure with thorough drying using a method as specified under 6-301.12, which is the section on drying your hands. So consumer guidelines are written in language that consumers can understand in an effort to decrease the risk of cross-contamination from hands, whereas the guidelines for food service staff are more detailed, in part because they're regulatory language, so they have to be more detailed, and also because those folks are handling food probably for a large number of people, and so the consequences of a problem are more severe. And so there needs to be a consistent and more detailed professional approach.
Great. Okay. Dr. Schaffner, CDC healthcare recommendations for hand washing differ for hands that are visibly soiled and those that are not visibly soiled. Why do these guidelines differ?
That's a really good question. There was an excellent paper that came out in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Reports quite a number of years ago that went over the CDC healthcare hand washing recommendations. In that particular case, the workers are different, the environment is different, and the soils on the hands are different. The CDC, when it comes to healthcare, recommends that or states that an alcohol-based hand sanitizer is actually the preferred method for cleaning your hands if they are not visibly dirty. CDC goes on to state it's more effective at killing potentially deadly germs on the hands than soap. It requires less time. The hand wash or the alcohol hand sanitizer dispensers are often more accessible than hand washing sinks. You need plumbing for a sink. You don't need plumbing for a alcohol hand sanitizer dispenser. The alcohol-based hand sanitizer produces reduced bacterial counts on hands, and in fact, although some people believe incorrectly that it can irritate the skin, it actually can improve skin condition and result in less irritation than compared to washing with soap and water. Now, CDC goes on to state that visibly soiled hands showing visible dirt or visibly contaminated with proteinaceous material, blood, or other bodily fluids, i.e. fecal material or urine that you might find in a hospital, those hands need to be washed. So when hands are visibly dirty or contaminated in that manner, the hands should be washed with either a non-antimicrobial soap or antimicrobial soap and water. And we've done some research on plain versus antimicrobial soaps, but briefly, plain soaps are detergent-based products that contain what are esterified fatty acids and sodium or potassium hydroxide. Their cleaning activity is attributed to their detergent properties, and those detergent properties result in the physical removal of dirt, soil, and various organic substances, including microorganisms. Plain soap have minimal, if any, antimicrobial activity. However, just hand washing with plain soap will remove loosely adherent transient bacterial flora. For example, some research has shown that hand washing with plain soap and water for 15 seconds reduces bacterial counts on the skin by about a half a log to 1 log, whereas washing for 30 seconds reduces counts by a little bit less than 2 to a little bit less than 3 logs, again, depending upon the research publication and the method used. Bottom line is washing hands with antimicrobial or non-antimicrobial soap and water will help to physically remove microorganisms, including spores, from the surface of contaminated hands.
Okay. Dr. Schaffner, in your 2015 article published in Food Protection Trends, Quantitative Analysis of Hand Washing Signs and Poster Guidance, you found that employee hand washing poster instructions varied. What did you conclude from this variation?
Well, first I have to acknowledge my graduate student, Dane Jensen, who's the first author on that publication. This was part of his PhD research, and it was really a project that he undertook because of his passion and interest in the subject. He did an internet search to find out all of all the hand washing signs that were available in English, and he quantified the recommendations. He looked at lather time recommendations, rinse time recommendations, overall hand wash time, water temperature recommendations, water use, drying method, hand washing technique if it was mentioned, and the total number of steps. In his internet research, he found 81 unique hand washing signs. Now, these signs range from 1 step to 13 steps. So 1 step would be wash your hands, and then 13 steps, you can imagine how complicated it would be. He found that 37 of the signs indicated a specific lathering time, and if you average those lathering times, the average was around 18 seconds. No sign suggested more than 20 seconds of lathering, and none suggested less than 10 seconds of lathering. 24 signs specifically recommended the use of warm water. 2 signs recommended water at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and 1 sign recommended using hot water. 62 signs explicitly made a recommendation on drying hands, and 53 of the signs suggested using a paper towel. Now, what you might conclude from that is there's a lot of different ways to tell people how to wash their hands, and it is perhaps not unreasonable to think that people would be a little bit confused given that there's all these directions out there on how to wash your hands. Now, what this paper didn't do was to come up with the perfect sign, but certainly we hope our study will serve as a foundation for future research on hand washing signage.
Interesting. Now, Dr. Schaffner, what should backfighters be thinking about regarding hand hygiene risk assessment versus risk management?
Well, this is a really good question. So I often, when I'm giving advice to people who are educators, I like to draw this distinction between risk assessment and risk management. Because if you understand this point, I think it helps you understand why there's maybe some confusion out there or there's different recommendations out there, and it may help you be a better educator as well. So risk assessment deals with how big is the risk that we are trying to manage and what factors control that risk. Risk assessment is a scientific process. It's performed by scientists, but it's really important to remember that risk assessment will never tell you what to do. So, for example, we've published quite a few papers now on hand washing and cross-contamination, but none of those papers will definitively give you a recommendation about what to do, because that recommendation about what to do is a risk management decision. Now, before I move on to risk management, the other thing that I want to point out is that, and I'm sure most of the folks on the call realize this, there's no such thing as zero risk, right? We don't live in a risk-free world. And so, but what we have to do when we make a risk management recommendation, such as wash your hands for 20 seconds in warm soapy water, that is drawing a line and saying, well, this is good enough to manage the risk. So risk management is not a scientific process. It's informed by the science, but it's not a scientific process in and of itself. And it deals with what do we do about the risk that we are trying to manage. It is a social process, a societal process. In other words, it deals with recommendations about what to do, and it's often done by committees and building consensus. Risk management is done by people in the government, but also people in the food industry, and these people may or may not be scientists.
Interesting. Okay. That's a good point to remember, the difference between assessment and management, and that there is no zero risk. We're trying to reduce the risk as best we can, informed by the science, right? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, before we go to questions, what should health and food safety educators do now to better communicate the science behind hand washing?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think part of what you need to do is keep up with the science. So, for example, and I'm going to go off script a little bit here, Mary, we have a paper coming out next month in the Journal of Food Protection where we studied hand washing, water temperature and lathering times, and different volumes of soap. And so people should realize that the science is constantly evolving, and you will probably be hearing from me later on this month, where I'm going to talk about the fact that based on our most recent research, water temperature doesn't really seem to make a difference. So I would say to the folks on the call, don't be discouraged if you hear that the science is changing. You need to give advice that's specific to the situation. And so think about that person who's sitting there in the kitchen and they're asking you about their specific situation. What should I do after I've just cut up raw chicken? Well, after you've just cut up raw chicken would be a great opportunity to wash your hands with warm soapy water. And you know what? One of the things that we do in my kitchen here in my house is we keep a bottle of hand sanitizer right there by the kitchen sink so that after you wash your hands, you can use some hand sanitizer. So I know we only have limited time here today, Mary, and I'm really anxious to talk to the folks on the line and to see if I can answer some questions.
Well, that's great. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions. In fact, you have a couple that came in ahead of time, which we'll start with, but we have a great group of backfighters on the phone. Here's the reminder of how to ask a question of Dr. Schaffner. On your phone, press *6 and then 1. And that will put you in the queue, and I'll see that you want to ask a question, and I'll call on you, probably using your area code and your last 4 digits, just so you'll know that I'm about to call on you. You'll also get a message in your ear. So *6, then 1, and when we go into the Q&A mode, which is coming right up, that's how you ask a question. So we're going to go to Q&A mode now, and you're going to hear that message from the automated voice. Okay, so just one more time, *6 and then 1 to ask a question. And while folks are getting in the queue, I have a couple questions that came in ahead of time. So this is from Gail. She's a nutrition coordinator with Head Start and Early Childhood Programs in Lansing, Michigan. So she writes, in recent years, I've noticed that official hand washing guidance doesn't deal with how to turn off the faucet after washing your hands. Previous guidance that she's familiar with always instructed to dry hands with a paper towel and use the towel to turn off the faucet. Then she says she remembers seeing revised guidance from the CDC regarding how evidence showed that touching the faucet with clean hands did not appear to impact the spread of disease. So the guidance now just omits any reference to turning off the faucet. So then she says, I still encounter best practice guidance that still recommends not touching the faucet with clean hands. What's the latest science on that, Dr. Schaffner?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it really takes me back to the whole reason why I got into hand washing in the first place. And I have to acknowledge Jim Mann, who I think might be on the call today. Jim was instrumental in funding some of that early research in our lab because at the time he was working for a company that was interested in developing a touch-free faucet because of exactly this issue, the cross-contamination to the hand taps. And so again, the decision about what to do in that circumstance is a risk management decision. I would say most of the time, if your hands are relatively clean to start with, you're going to transfer very few, if any, pathogenic bacteria to those taps, and so you wash your hands as you normally would. You take your clean hands and you put them back on those relatively clean taps, and you can turn them off. I would say certainly if you're in a situation where you have just changed a poopy diaper or you've just handled raw chicken, you are much more likely to have microorganisms, pathogenic microorganisms on your hand. And so in a situation like that, maybe what I would do would be to maybe use a paper towel or something to try to get as much of that physical debris off my hands as possible, turn the tap on, wash my hands, and then maybe if I can, use my elbow or use another clean paper towel to turn the tap off to reduce that cross-contamination. So realize that, cross-contamination does happen, but most of the time, if you have relatively clean hands, I wouldn't worry too much about that hand to tap, back to hand cross-contamination.
All right. Very interesting. It looks like we have a couple calls here. I'm going to pick on, I don't have a phone number, I have an actual name, Donald Clark or Clark Donald. I'm going to select you, and you can go ahead and ask your questions of Dr. Schaffner.
Hello, my name is Jeffrey Clark. I'm a student at the University of Arkansas PhD program, and I was just wondering what a risk-based approach to hand washing would look like for restaurants when, workers might have to wash their hands. It's been documented anywhere from 9 to 29 times an hour, and it's just not possible. So, what would that look? What would a risk-based approach to hand washing look like in that context? Do you think?
Oh, Jeffrey, you are a man after my own heart. So I have served on the Conference for Food Protection Hand Washing Committee for a couple of cycles, and I have tried vainly or tried in vain to advance a science-based approach to hand washing. I will say this is my own personal opinion. This certainly isn't the opinion of the conference, but what I would say is what I think we need to do, because as you point out clearly, washing your hands 20 times an hour is not, no one's going to actually do that, and so it's silly to pretend that people are going to be doing that. What I would say is we need to look at tiering the kind of events that would trigger a hand wash. So in other words, if I am just changing from one task where I have unlikely to have contaminated my hands to another task, I really shouldn't worry about hand washing. On the other hand, if I have just handled raw meat, definitely I want to have some hand washing in that circumstance. If I have just gone to the bathroom and moved my bowels, I definitely want to wash my hands under those circumstances. And so I would say a risk-based hand washing approach would incorporate levels of severity when you need to wash your hands. I would also say, and again, this is based on my own research and my own opinion, it's certainly not the opinion of the FDA, we've shown that under some circumstances, use of hand sanitizers instead of a hand wash, so just like the CDC is recommending for hospitals, in those circumstances, you can actually get significant bacterial reduction on the hands that would be equivalent to a hand wash, even when there's visible debris on the hands. And so we've done some research where people handled hamburger that was contaminated with a marker bacterium, and we showed that we could control the levels of contamination using hand sanitizer only. Again, that's a controversial opinion. It's not the opinion of the FDA, but that is also one way we could move forward with a risk-based approach. As I noted earlier, if you are in situations where you don't have access to a sink, or again, like a hospital like the CDC is talking about, in those circumstances, alcohol-based hand sanitizers, in my opinion, can be a useful alternative to a hand wash.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Schaffner. Okay, let's move on to the next caller. This is area code 515, and the last four are 3330. We're going to you now. So you can go ahead and ask Dr. Schaffner a question.
Hi, this is Carlene Russell, the Iowa Department on Aging, and I wondered if you would comment about the difference between using liquid soap or bar soap for reducing risk.
That's a good question. So there's in food service, bar soaps are just not used. I believe they are prohibited by the code. Obviously, in our homes, we often have bar soaps. We've actually, in my house, we've actually gone to using liquid soap by the sink just because it's easier to dispense, but we still have bar soap in the bathrooms. That's just our preference. Now, there has been some research, and it's quite a few years old, and it's been a while since I've looked at it. But, of course, the concern with bar soap is that if you have very contaminated hands and you lather up with the bar soap, you will have left some contamination on the soap. And then when you go back later to wash your hands again, you're actually recontaminating your hands. I think that is a rather rare and unusual circumstance. I don't think it happens very much. But I do, again, want to take an opportunity to plug some research that has not yet been published where I do think there is a risk, and again, I want to caution, this is my own personal opinion, but it is backed up by what is as yet unpublished research, and actually there's other research on this out there as well, and that is regarding what we call bulk refillable soaps. And again, this is an example of this would be if you go into a restaurant bathroom and you see that there's an open top container that you can just pour fresh soap in. And there's been ample evidence in the literature, including, again, our own as yet unpublished research that shows that those bulk soap dispensers can often become contaminated. But with respect to your own personal question, bar soap versus liquid soap, I would say that there's probably there might be a slight difference in risk, but certainly better to use that bar soap than to not wash your hands at all if your hands are visibly soiled.
Thank you.
Great answer, Dr. Schaffner. Very helpful. Okay, now we're going to move on to a person who has a 443 area code, and 3905 is your the last four digits. So can you go ahead and ask your question of Dr. Schaffner?
Yes, my name is Bill Dussault. My question to you, Dr. Schaffner, we all been told after you use a public restroom and you washed your hands with soap and water and you dried your hands, they recommend that you use a clean, dry paper towel to open a public restroom, bathroom door after you wash your hands. What is is there any new science that doesn't back that recommendation up anymore?
Well, yeah. So that's a good question. So, and my answer has a couple of components to it. So the first question is, or the first thing to think about is, what's the likelihood that inner bathroom door actually has any contamination on it, right? So the idea is that you've just washed your hands are clean. What's the possibility that the inside of that bathroom door has contamination that's going to spread to your hands? The answer to that is, as far as I know, no one has studied that, but I would say that probably the risk of pathogens being there are fairly small. So there's a small risk, but again, probably almost vanishingly small. Certainly, there have been situations where if I'm in a bathroom and I have access to paper towels and maybe I'm worried about the quality of the sanitation in the bathroom, I will do that. I will use a paper towel to open that bathroom door. However, there are such situations where that's not available, and the bathroom has maybe hot air hand dryers or other type of air dryer, and there's no paper towel available. Now, obviously, in that situation, if you were insistent upon using a paper towel to exit, you'd be stuck in that bathroom until somebody opened the door. So you have to be practical with respect to these things.
I was told by my Aunt Joyce, who used to practice in health, was a nurse in a healthcare area. She says if that situation occurs, she said bring a handkerchief with you. Put that handkerchief in the pocket, a clean handkerchief, I might add, and then put your hands on top of that clean handkerchief and pull the door that way.
That's also a really good idea. And actually, what I'm really happy to see in a lot of situations, in high throughput public bathrooms, like in airports and things, they've just done away with doors altogether, and you just have an entryway that you can walk in or out with touching the door. So there are things we can do in terms of the technology to manage that. Also, increasingly, I see bathroom doors that can be opened for people with disabilities, can be opened by pushing a button with your elbow or with your hip, and so I will often use those if I'm trying to exit the bathroom and I don't have a paper towel. So there's options there. You just have to sort of think ahead and plan. And like you said, great idea to carry a handkerchief with you if you're worried about that.
Great, thanks. Great question. Now we're at the end of our half hour. If folks want to stay on the line, and the people who are in the queue right now who haven't gotten your question answered yet, hang on the line. Dr. Schaffner has agreed to answer a few more questions, but I just need to wrap it up, but we won't close this. I want to thank everyone who's been here, because I know some people are on a tight schedule and need to be done in a half an hour. So we hope everyone learned a lot. Just want to let you know we have a Partnership for Food Safety Education webinar coming up on June 8th with Betty Fang and Christine Brunn, both PhDs at UC Davis. This is going to be on food safety education using a positive deviance approach, which is another behavior change method which has been shown to be quite effective. We also want to thank the sponsors of our webinars and knowledge exchanges, Ecolab, SMI Foundation, Produce Marketing Association, Field Air Diversity, Walmart, Cargill, Foundation for Meat and Poultry Research and Education, General Mills, the Hershey Company, NSF International, USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service. So we appreciate all that support, and thank you all for participating today. If you want to stay on the line a little later, if you have a few more minutes, we have a few more calls that Dr. Schaffner has agreed to answer. So now I'm going to go on to the person who has a 905 area code and ends with a 4482. I'm picking you now, and you should be able to ask Dr. Schaffner your question.
Hi, this is Lisa Kennedy from the Canadian Partnership from Consumer Food Safety Education. And I was just wondering if there's... Hello?
Yeah, I'm here. Lisa, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Sorry. I didn't know. Did you hear the first bit?
Yes.
Yeah, I heard the whole thing.
I just got another... Okay. I just had a beep in my ear. Anyway, I was just wondering if there was any science between or recommendations for consumers in their homes on whether or not while they're in their kitchen preparing meals, if they should use a paper towel to dry their hands as opposed to a cloth towel.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we some of our recently published research actually looked at the number of bacteria transferred to the paper towel. And so we used the non-pathogenic marker bacteria, inoculated people's hands, had them wash their hands, and then compared where they dried their hands by letting their hands just sort of sit in the air versus using a paper towel. And what we discovered was that they did get additional reduction by that physical action of the paper towel scrubbing their hand and wicking the water, which probably contains some bacteria, onto the paper towel. And so on the one hand, that shows that paper towels are very effective and they do contribute to the hand wash, and so that is certainly a good thing. But let's take it back to your question of paper towel versus cloth towel. So now, again, I'll talk about my own experience in our home kitchen here. We have paper towels and cloth towels. And so obviously if you're in a high-risk situation where you've just been handling raw chicken or beef or something, and again, you think that there's likely pathogens on your hands, I would suggest under those circumstances using a paper towel, because if there are any residual pathogens on your hands, you want to get them onto a paper towel so that you can throw them in the trash and not leave them residual on that cloth towel. So like I said, in our house we use cloth towels because it is probably a little bit better for the environment, but then also realize that those cloth towels can, number one, retain pathogens. If they get wet, they can promote pathogen growth, and of course they need to be washed on a regular basis probably in the hot cycle, maybe with some bleach in your dishwasher. So I would...
Thank you.
Great. Dr. Schaffner, you're still there. Good. You sort of sounded like you get cut off. Okay. Great question. Thank you. We're going to move on now to a person whose area code is 201. And the last four are 8434. Go ahead and ask Dr. Schaffner your question. You there? 201, area code 201-8434. Go ahead and ask Dr. Schaffner your question.
Hi, Dr. Schaffner. I'm a food service director in New Jersey for a veterans home. My question is, what is the science behind teaching, what's the verbology you recommend to help people understand why they should wash their hands even when wearing a latex glove?
Well, that's a good question, and I have to say I am not an expert on communication necessarily, but I think that the key thing to point out with respect to gloves is that the gloves are not a perfect barrier, and the gloves may protect you, but they don't necessarily protect the work. So in other words, if you are using gloves to handle raw meats and then you go to handle fresh vegetables with those same gloves, you're going to spread that cross-contamination. And so that's why the food code recommendation is that every time you change your gloves, you also wash your hands. We did some research on gloves a few years back, looking at some real cheap food service style gloves, and we discovered that there is bacterial penetration through those gloves. And so just because you're wearing gloves doesn't mean that the bacteria aren't getting to your hands despite the gloves. And so you always want to couple those glove changes with a hand wash, especially if you've been performing, a high risk activity with raw meat or something like that. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Doctor.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Okay. Our next question is from area code 303. The last four are 1920. So 303, area code, last four, 1920. Go ahead and ask Dr. Schaffner your question.
Yes, Dr. Schaffner, this is Sheila from Colorado. My question is, why would not warm water always be preferred over cold water for washing hands when warm water will help dissolve any oils on the skin and wash bacteria away? I mean, if you've ever tried to wash Crisco off your hands with cold water, you could stand there for an hour, but once you use warm water, it's much more efficient.
Oh, I'm so glad that you asked this question. This is one of my favorite questions of late, again, because in part because of the research that we're publishing in Journal of Food Protection next month. So you are absolutely right. If you have lipid or fats on your hands, those fats are going to be much more easily removed by the use of warm water. And so I want to point out that in our particular study that's coming out soon, these were hands that were contaminated with bacteria without any sort of an interfering food matrix. So certainly under those circumstances where you don't have any interfering food compound, you can use warm water, you can use cold water. Based on our research, there doesn't seem to be a statistically significant difference. But again, I would caution people to be practical about this, right? If you, let's take the 20-second recommendation. If you've got chicken goop on your hands or you've got raw meat on your hands, and you've washed your hands for 20 seconds and you still feel like you have raw meat on your hands, don't stop just because the recommendation is 20 seconds. Keep on washing until your hands feel clean. Same thing with respect to hot water or warm water, right? We also know that people, warm water is more comfortable for washing your hands. So certainly, while cold water might be just as effective, especially if there's no interfering food matrix, the warm water is going to be more comfortable for you, as well as helping to remove contamination. And so I think people have to, and this is why it's so important, I think, to think about the science instead of getting blindly stuck into these cookie-cutter recommendations. Obviously, yes, if you think that you've got something on your hands that hot water or warm water can remove, by all means do that. That's really good practical advice.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, the next question, and we have just two more questions here. 407 is the area code, and 9219 is the last four. I'm going to select your phone. Area code 407, last four 9219. Go ahead and ask Dr. Schaffner your question.
Hi, my name is hello? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're on. Go ahead.
Okay, I had it muted. Okay, in terms of practical application, what is the thinking about kitchen sponges? I know everyone says that they're horrible, but that they can be used if they are sanitized in maybe a microwave or the dishwasher. Is that still true, or are they definitely out the window?
Yeah, excellent question. So you're referring to some research by my friend and colleague, some research on sponges, and you've encapsulated that research perfectly. Basically, it showed that, and other research by Chuck Gerba, my colleague at the University of Arizona, has done, or Arizona State, I apologize, I'm not sure which, and I probably offended half the people in Arizona with that. But what I would say is that, yes, we know that sponges can be a harborage point Why? Because they accumulate food debris, because they retain moisture, and bacteria need food and moisture to multiply, and so sponges can definitely be a source of contamination. But your recommendation to wash those sponges in the automatic dishwasher or to heat them in a microwave with a little bit of water, those are really good recommendations. Personally, we have an automatic dishwasher in our kitchen, and so we will periodically throw the sponges in there after we've used them a few times and they're starting to maybe smell or look a little bit off. The only caution I would say, if you don't have an automatic dishwasher and you want to sanitize your sponges in the microwave, just be very careful about that because what you want to do is you want to be sure that you don't light your sponges on fire, and those sponges will ignite in a microwave if you don't keep them moist or if the temperature gets too high. But those are still absolutely best practice recommendations, and sponges can still be a source of contamination. So thank you for bringing that up.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. So, Dr. Schaffner, the last question is one that Ann Zander of Extension of Boulder County in Longmont, Colorado, sent in. She said, when doing our hand washing trainings for cottage food producers who are making and selling allowable food products in their home kitchens that are not inspected, I guess their home kitchens are not inspected, we stress that they need to wash their hands. And at every one of these trainings, she says, people will ask about using hand sanitizers at every training. So they're making food in their home for sale to the public. What would your recommendation be there around sanitizers?
Yeah, well, so first let me just briefly talk about cottage foods. This is a really important issue. It's heating up across the country. We have some folks trying to establish a cottage food law in New Jersey. I think we're one of the only states without one. And so certainly this is an important part of our clientele that we try to reach and we try to educate. And I would say it comes back to my earlier advice about the nature of what it is that you're making. If you don't have highly contaminated hands and you're in a hurry, it's better to use hand sanitizer than to do nothing. If you have time, certainly wash your hands with warm soapy water or comfortable soapy water. That's a great recommendation. But again, if you're in a hurry and it's a choice between sanitizer or nothing, I will always choose to use the sanitizer. Excellent question.
Okay. You know what? We just got one more final call. This is from area code 908, and the last four is 5749. So area code 908, last four 5749. Go ahead and ask Dr. Schaffner the last question of the Knowledge Exchange.
Good afternoon, Dr. Schaffner. Michelle Samara-Tim. I'm an educator in Somerset County. Thank you for a very great afternoon. What I'd like to know, though, is that folks in the call are backfighters, and how can we as backfighters encourage hand washing might be different based on the audience, whether we're trying to address strangers in a public restroom or maybe coworkers at work or even our spouse and children. So I was just wondering if you can share any best practices or unique practices you have seen that have been effective in encouraging these folks to wash their hands after restroom use.
Wow, thank you. At 908 area code, Michelle, I thought it might be you. So thank you. This is a tough question, and I will say I am not a communication expert. For that, you'd have to turn to my podcast partner, Ben Chapman. But what I would say is what you need to do is to convince people, and again, so let's specifically talk about restroom use, right? Again, and let's think about tiers of risk. While it's a great practice to wash your hands after you use the restroom, I'm especially concerned if after you've moved your bowels, because your hands are much more likely to be contaminated with pathogenic bacteria after that. And so, again, I would take a risk-based approach and say, look, nobody wants to eat poop, and so you should wash your hands after you poop. And sometimes something as simple and direct as that is all it takes, Michelle. But thank you. It's a really good question. Obviously, we haven't figured out the answer yet because we still have a lot more work to do to get people to wash their hands.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Schaffner. And thank you for all of you. About 92 of you stayed on for most of the rest of the over 30-minute questions. Great questions. Glad we got to answer all of them. Thank you so much, Dr. Schaffner, and thanks to all the backfighters who attended. Okay, we're going to end this now. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.